The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. An average of 29 people are coming into homelessness every month in Nanaimo, according to the community's Systems Planning Organization. The organization, also known as SPO for short, exists to provide research, data analysis, education, and information related to the community's homelessness response. It also exists to provide coordinated action and advocacy on behalf of Nanaimo's non-profit organizations and other community stakeholders to address an end to homelessness in Nanaimo. The SPO began operations in April of 2023. Today on the program, I speak with a trio at the heart of the SPO for updates on what they've been able to achieve so far.
My name is Don Bonner. I'm the chair of the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization, and I was also chair of the Health and Housing Task Force, which one of the recommendations from that task force was creation of the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization. So after my tenure on council, I'm now chairing this organization.
Hi, my name is Andrew Thornton. I'm the Research and Knowledge Mobilization Lead for Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization. I've been working with John for about 10 years now on different issues related to social justice and research in Nanaimo, and actually more broadly across Canada. In fact, I've also been the co-coordinator of the last 4 point-in-time counts.
I'm John McCormick, Executive Director of the Nanaimo System Planning Organization, the SPO. Andrew, just as being underselling himself, he's also really our sort of local resident research guy who I'll rely on for information research. The SPO was set up through that task force, which really brought together all of the key participants, I think, City, Nanaimo First Nation, BC Housing, Island Health, community agencies. I think there were others around the table as well. It's always dangerous naming names. And that work, really identified that the SPO was going to be helpful because none of those community agencies, nor the city, nor BC Housing, nor Island Health felt that they could speak in a way or work on a community-wide basis in a sort of independent way that was sort of non-aligned and really focused specifically on health and housing and the impact of providing housing for the well-being of community members who are marginalized, at risk of homelessness, and also just completely unsheltered. So the point in time count, I know we're going to talk about a little later, is it really does sort of demonstrate the situation we're in Nanaimo.
Well, thank you all three of you for making time to speak with me on that front of a community, non-affiliated, community-wide response to issues like health, housing, homelessness. What has changed? What has the SPO been able to do in 2024 on those fronts?
I think so we've been really operational. The board was set up, and it took about 4 months, Don, for the team to get hired, and we were hired kind of as a group. I applied to be the executive director, and brought Andrew and my financial controller and Beecroft on side immediately, and then we added to that a data coordinator, and we've recently just in the past couple of weeks added First Nations advisor. Our role in the last year and a half has touched on something around 238 units of housing. Not something that we do in isolation, but we've certainly had a significant role to play in much of that work much of that housing that's coming online, and we're certainly part of every one of those conversations. In addition to that, in one aspect of that, the Travelers Lodge specifically, we played the key role. We also played the sort of lead role on the setting up of an extreme weather response program, which had been in Nanaimo up until about 2017. And then we hadn't had access to that because, again, there was no real lead organization to take that on, to work with BC Housing to bring that program back to Nanaimo. So that's some of the work that we've done that's really tangible. And then on the sort of developmental side, we're doing a lot of work with community agencies to assist in setting the table for more housing to come online in various forms over time. And some of that I'll talk about in general terms as we go through the conversation.
So you mentioned there are 238 homes over the course of the last year or so, the Travelers Lodge project. Could you give a little bit more info on maybe what that housing looks like, what some of the different projects it's spread across are, and how exactly the SPO plays into that picture?
I'll talk about the SPO first and how the role that we play. So we act in a consulting and support capacity for the most part, and we work with our community partners and stakeholders. So we don't speak on behalf of our community partners or stakeholders. And if we're not the lead on a project, I won't be the one to speak on behalf of a project except after it's become public. Some of those projects are things that we are participating in but haven't necessarily been identified, or really we're not the lead on, so I'm not going to speak on behalf of them because I don't want to put those projects in jeopardy. And furthermore, it's not really our responsibility to do that. We cede that ground to the organizations that are the lead. Sometimes it's the city, sometimes it's BC Housing. We know that there's housing coming online associated with a navigation center but we don't know what the timeline is yet on that. Everyone has seen the work that's happening down the Island Highway. That's around the what's the street, Don? 10th Avenue and the Island Highway. So that is about 50 units, I think, of housing that's coming online that is paid for by something called Heart and Hearth programming. And that's BC Housing led. And then there are a number of other projects that haven't been announced or in the process of being announced that we're having conversations about. Our role often is to provide that kind of feedback about where the community's at. The community, and when I say community, I mean community agencies or community housing service providers. And also we do some heavy lifting on behalf of the community. For example, around strategy work or policy work. We're currently working on projects that involve aspects of that at the current time. And again, not things I'm going to necessarily name publicly because they're not our documents, and it's not specifically our role to be the spokesperson on those. But that's the kind of ways in which we participate. We participate at a policy level, at a consulting level, in a sort of just heavy lifting level, sometimes research level, data collection, and data reporting level.
There's the housing unit number, there are the concrete measures, but my understanding is another core idea that the SPO is supposed to coordinate and manage is just the understanding of the needs and the data around the issue of housing needs in Nanaimo. In November, there was a point in time count to address the number of people experiencing homelessness in the community. What can you tell me about how that went and when we might be able to know some of the results and what you came away from that with?
So this is the fourth federally, nationally coordinated point in time count. Actually, it's the fifth that Nanaimo's been involved in since 2016. It's the fourth one that I helped to co-coordinate. And the really important development this year was the project was actually led by Nanaimo First Nation in the persons of Connie Paul and Marina White and their housing outreach team, which had, I think, has had a very positive impact in terms of the reach, in terms of contacting and connecting with Indigenous unhoused, both on nation and in the community broadly construed. One of the other things that was really, really valuable and really actually exciting, I can say that, was the city of Nanaimo and the community safety officers through the Office of Public Safety allowed surveyors to use their GIS system so that we were able to, once a team had been to a place and had surveyed there, they put a dot on it. So, and everyone else who was surveying had access to that so that we didn't have duplication of routes and spaces. But it also enabled us to really get an absolute, almost a blanket coverage of the city, which was not possible previously without having dozens and hundreds of volunteers, because otherwise we would have to just keep sending people. So that was a really valuable contribution by the city. And it will have made a very significant impact on the quality of the data. Not perhaps the quantity, but absolutely the quality. So we won't end up with a lot of duplicate surveys, which is one of the tasks that is on my desk. I have to go through a pile of 500 or 600 surveys and have a look and see how many of those look like they're the surveys of the same person. So the results, I am actually legally bound not to say anything until I get the spreadsheet back. So I haven't sent away the stack of surveys. We send away the stack of surveys. A data input company spends 2 or 3 weeks putting them in a beautiful spreadsheet for me. It comes back to me, and then I can talk authoritatively about the numbers. I can't really do that until I get the spreadsheet back, because even then I have to look through it and do deduplicate within it to make sure we've kind of weeded out all the duplicates. What I will say is, and people get tired of me saying this, pit counts are always undercounts. They really are a snapshot. They are not a definitive picture. And this doesn't matter how many times you say this to people. They say, why is the number higher? Why was the number this? So the point of that is they're about trend data and showing us where the trend is. And since 2016, the trend has all been in one direction. And that has been increasing number of unhoused. And without giving away the data, I can see so far, my guess is from the data I have and that I've filtered is going to be higher than it was last time. But what the pit count also gives us is the profile of the unhoused in Nanaimo. And that's, in many ways, its most important function, besides communicating what's going on in the community, is actually giving us, and that's part of your question was, how do we know who's unhoused and how long they've been unhoused? The pit count is one of the few sources that we have of that. We know that outreach workers who we work with on a regular basis through other avenues do have their own case files, but there's no community-wide picture of the unhoused, except, and this is a bit of a segue away from the pit count, in May, June, July, August, we collated 2 sets of data. That is me and Willow Hills, our data coordinator. One of them was from the outshop that was run by CMHA for 4 years. And that gave us data on the number of people who used it, the number of new users who used it each month, and over a 4-year period. And you could only use it if you were unhoused. And it actually shows us that on average, about 29 people, that I realize that's a pretty precise number, but it's a mathematical number, were using the service. New users for every month were about 29. So we can make a pretty good educated guess that on average, about 29 unhoused people in Nanaimo people were becoming unhoused, or at least they were coming to Nanaimo and using that service. That's a pretty significant number. What we don't have...
That's every month. That's every month.
Yeah, every month for 4 years. What we don't have, but that we're working with BC Housing and the federal government on, is numbers on outflow. That is, out of homelessness. Either we lose track of them, or people end up in housing. That's the really important data, and we're working on that. And everyone in the whole world wants to know those numbers, not just in Nanaimo, but in every community, because you can count the number of unhoused, but you also, in terms of talking about homelessness, you need to know that people are being housed all the time. Not the numbers we would like, not as fast as we would like, but they absolutely are being housed. So our homelessness issues and structure is actually quite complex. We have inflow, we have people in homelessness, and then we have outflow. We lose track of them, or they get housed, or they move to another community. So, and we don't have a real strong sense of those. And in communities where they do, it does make a difference, because you can also say to people, look, it's not just that our numbers are increasing, people are being housed. We need even more commitment, more resources to house people. Because even if we said today there's 1,000 unhoused in Nanaimo, we don't need 1,000 units to house them. We need a lot more, because we have constant inflow. Even if we housed every one of those people today, we're still going to have inflow into homelessness, which is a very complex process. We know some of the indicators and many of the paths, but we're always having inflow. So even if we got the number of units we wanted for today, that's not going to address the problem, because the problem is both structural and individual, and the interface between individuals and the systems they live in. So that's kind of a little bit lectury, but that's kind of what I do. But it's a really important thing to talk about when we talk about data and homelessness. And I'll just give you for instance, in places like Los Angeles, which have thousands and thousands of unhoused, they have also in the last 5 years, I've read their data, they've housed thousands and thousands of people. They have made a real serious commitment in the city and county of Los Angeles to house the unhoused, and yet they still have thousands and thousands of unhoused. So the problem isn't necessarily finding housing, it's turning off the tap of inflow into homelessness. And we need to think about those things in Nanaimo. That's why we need better data and multiple sources of data and multiple sources of commitment. So the other thing that we did around data was we call it a by name blitz. We went to all the kind of outreach workers and agencies that do that work, and we said, what list do you have? We don't care if it's on paper, if it's on a chalkboard, if it's in Excel. And we gathered them all together and we deduplicated it. And from the period of, I think from May 2024, going back a year, we counted about 1,000 unhoused, which is the same number of people, unique users, who also use the outshop, which I talked about earlier. So what we have is two sets of data that were collected over different periods of time and using different methodologies, and they've come up with more or less the same number. Now that number has also that's an estimate that outreach workers have made, as well as CSOs, as well as RCMP, and people who work in the sector. So we've got three sources of data. We got best guess, the outshop, and our by name blitz are all pointing that it's about 1,000. Now, again, those don't necessarily give us the demographics, but we have our demographic data from other places, like the PIC count, like from MSDPR, and something that most listeners will not have heard of, the BC government's integrated data project, which has tracked people through the looking at MSDPR data and island health data, and merging those to see what kind of numbers of people who are living either in poverty and or in being unhoused.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. Support and grow our nonprofit newsroom project today at chly.ca/donate with a monthly or one-time donation. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
Today on the program, we're talking about the data around homelessness in Nanaimo. My guests are John McCormick, Andrew Thornton, and Don Bonner, who are with the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization, or SPO for short. The organization exists to provide data and coordinate the community's response to homelessness. It started operations in April 2023. To sum all that up, we have an idea that there are about 1,000 people experiencing homelessness in Nanaimo. We even have a by name list of those people. We have a rough idea that on average in a given month, there are 29 people likely entering homelessness or at least using some services for the first time. We don't know necessarily how many people are exiting homelessness in Nanaimo. We have all that data. What happens with the data? How does it get used? You present that to someone, say at BC Housing. What happens?
Yeah, I can answer this and then I'll let John answer it better. It essentially, so we have these conversations with the province, with the city and city staff, and it does get used. The PIC count data, it's been spoken back to me many, many times by BC Housing staff, by federal staff, and they do use that to make estimates about needed resources. And it's not like BC Housing is naive about this either. They know there are not exactly 515 unhoused in Nanaimo, but they know that's what it says in our PIC count. But they also use the demographic shape to help. It's not definitive, to help decide on priorities. Do we need more housing for youth? Do we need more housing for seniors? Do we need more housing for people with mental health problems? So that's how it gets used, and it does get used. It is not a nicety. It's not a research report that sits in an academic journal that 17 other people read, and that's the end of it. This data does get used, and to be fair, people do want the data. They want to be able to be seen to be making decisions that are evidence based, and not making, what's the phrase? It's just evidence based decision making or decision based evidence making. I think it's the former, right? Although a lot of people tend to believe it is, people make decisions or produce the evidence that matches their decisions. I don't think that's the case in this space. I don't know what else John might say.
Andrew's right. I mean, and these are big, the decisions, and Don can speak to this. I'll lead him a little bit here. That decisions are made well in advance by governments, by jurisdictions about where money's going to go. And so we collect research today, and we give it to the Reaching Home people in Ottawa, or we give it to BC Housing, or we give it to the city. And that doesn't mean that things automatically happen right away. They can take, years, decades for change to happen. But you start with the data, and that's always where it starts. It's why it's sometimes difficult to justify spending money on data when you have people lined up needing food and shelter. But it's the necessary part of the conversation, because that all operations, all decisions by governments, who are really the only ones who can participate in helping to solve this, they represent communities. Their decisions are spreadsheet decisions ultimately. And Don can speak to that as a counselor. Like, you might want to do something, but it does come down to what the budget will allow. And if you don't have the money this year, you have to prioritize it and take it from somewhere else, or somehow raise the funds somehow. We can do some things with, certainly the SPO can do some things with money that comes from outside of government, but for the most part, that's where the rocket fuel is to make this work happen. BC Housing just, they sent us some information about how much money has been spent in Nanaimo, and it's significant. It's significant over the long haul. Numbers that won't be disclosed today on radio, but it's a significant amount of money, and it would be surprising, I think, to community members to know how much that is. And eventually, that information comes out. But it does, just to go back to that point, it takes us a long time to get from the research to a decision about, or priorities, communities that are prioritized. As an example, just Andrew and I did some research back in 2017, Andrew, 2018, 2019, comparing Nanaimo to other medium-sized communities. We defined what a medium-sized community was, up to about 150,000 people. Well, that research really only finally sort of resulted in sort of an outcome in around 2022, 23, because it takes that long for that information to kind of filter through the process and eventually lead to an outcome. So these are, we're talking about nation building and community building, and they're in timelines that are 25, 50, and 100 years in time. So when we talk about outflows and inflows, we don't have an immediate answer for it, but we know from the research that needs to be an area of priority, and then the wheels start to start moving along towards some outcomes. Don, do you want to speak about jurisdiction at all, or?
Well, yeah, one of the things that the SPO was created for was to provide data to councils so they could advocate to different levels of government. And the mayor mentioned to me one time, it says, I can go down to the province and I say, we need more housing. But the ask is much more important, is if he goes down, or the council goes down to the province and says, we need 40 units of transitional housing. We have the property already laid out to build it, or we need 110 units of emergency housing, things along those lines. So, and also having the data to back up those numbers. That's a much more powerful ask. And you'll find that the results are much better when each of the municipalities, specifically Nanaimo, can go down to the province and to the feds and say, here's exactly what we need, and here's the numbers to back it up, and then go it from there.
Now, I would imagine that the ask and the numbers that you would present are probably, at the moment at least, barring some radical shift, always going to outstrip the resources that are available. in the face of that, how do you prioritize? How do you, I think people can understand, building units of housing is a solution. But when you talked about that earlier piece of, we know that there are 29 people likely coming into homelessness in the community, and we need to turn off that tap, so to speak. What are the ways that the SPO can contribute to doing that?
That's a hard question to answer, but it really is, because it's the mix of both keeping people in housing, getting to know understanding who those people are before they become unhoused. If they're flowing into homelessness, they're flowing out of housing in some form or other. Maybe they're coming from a couch surfing circumstance. Maybe they're coming from a domestic circumstance that's, they've sort of broken apart and they're no longer have housing. But we won't necessarily always know. In fact, it's very hard to know. There is a rent bank that that Nanaimo and I was in particular helped to bring into fruition when I was the executive director at the Nanaimo John Howard Society, which is now known as Connective. And that does help once someone has flowed into homelessness. But prior to that, it's hard to know. And that's really part of the challenge. There isn't a person across the country involved in trying to address homelessness that wouldn't like to be able to turn off that tap. But there isn't a person across the country involved in homelessness who has a good answer for us about how to find out when someone's about to fall into homelessness, because it's private information. What it means is most of the programming dollars that are related to homelessness really are about when someone's, which is really unfortunate from Andrew, my perspective, and anyone else who's working in the area, because keeping someone housed is way more effective and easier to do than trying to house someone once they become homeless.
John McCormick is Executive Director of the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization. During the conversation, you also heard from Don Bonner, the group's board chair, and Andrew Thornton, the research and mobilization lead. The organization exists to provide data and to coordinate the community's response to homelessness. Over the holidays, we'll bring you part 2 of that conversation. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.